Imagine a narrow stretch of water, just 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, through which 1/5 of the world's petroleum passes every single day. Now imagine that the key to that gate is held by a regime that many argue is playing a high-stakes game of geopolitical chicken. We've been told we are on the verge of a historic peace deal, a diplomatic breakthrough that could stabilize the Middle East. But, as the ink dries on the Memorandum of Understanding, rockets are still flying in southern Lebanon, and leaked military audio suggests the gateway to global energy is still firmly locked. Are we looking at a genuine roadmap to peace? Or are we simply witnessing a highly sophisticated stalling tactic?
It is the defining question of the current geopolitical moment. What we are seeing is not a comprehensive peace agreement, but rather a fragile, temporary ceasefire that is being interpreted in two completely different ways by the parties involved. On one hand, you have the Western perspective, which views this as a step toward nuclear containment and regional stabilization. On the other hand, you have the view from Tehran, which sees the agreement as a tactical pause, a way to secure immediate economic relief, specifically the lifting of sanctions on oil and petrochemical exports, without actually dismantling their regional influence or their proxy networks. It is a classic mismatch of expectations, a deal where there is no real meeting of the minds.
Let's break this down systematically. If we look at the current situation through a SWOT analysis, what are the actual strengths and weaknesses of the positions both sides are holding?
If we start with the strengths of the current diplomatic framework, the primary strength is the immediate economic leverage. By offering to lift the oil sanctions immediately, the administration has created a massive financial carrot. For the United States and its allies, another strength is tactical military deterrence. The threat of overwhelming force remains a powerful tool to prevent total regional escalation. However, the weaknesses in this posture are glaring. The most significant weakness is the reliance on depleted strategic reserves. The United States has been dipping into its strategic petroleum reserve to keep global gas prices stable, but that buffer is running dangerously low. Some reports suggest we have only weeks of reserve capacity left. Furthermore, there is a fundamental structural weakness in how the deal handles proxy forces. You cannot easily negotiate a ceasefire with a state actor when their non-state proxies, like Hezbollah, operate as a state within a state, maintaining their own military agendas.
And that brings us directly to the opportunities and threats. The opportunity here seems to be the 60-day transition window established by the memorandum. It creates a structured pause to attempt to negotiate a more permanent framework and perhaps pressure the Lebanese government to assert control over its own territory. But the threats seem to dwarf that opportunity. If the Strait of Hormuz is closed, we aren't just talking about a localized conflict. We are talking about a global economic collapse. If gas prices in Europe climb to the equivalent of $10 a gallon due to supply disruptions and heavy domestic taxes, the economic shockwaves will hit every corner of the global market.
Exactly. And to understand how these forces interact, we have to look at the most analysis, the mission, objectives, strategies, and tactics of the key players. If we look at the Western mission, it is regional containment and economic stability. Their objective is to keep the Strait of Hormuz open and freeze nuclear enrichment. Their strategy is a mixture of economic incentives and targeted deterrence, and their tactics involve structured negotiations and temporary sanctions relief. But look at the Iranian mission. Their mission is regional hegemony and the preservation of the regime. Their objective is the complete removal of the economic blockade and the withdrawal of Western forces from the region. Their strategy is proxy warfare combined with diplomatic stalling, and their tactics are ceasefire violations, leaked threats, and demanding last-minute concessions.
It's like a used car salesman who waits until you've agreed on the price of the car, and then suddenly tells you the wheels aren't included. They keep adding terms at the last minute because they know the other side is desperate to close the deal.
That is a perfect analogy. They understand that the complexity of the agreement works in their favor. The more complex the deal, the harder it is to catch them in a clear violation, and the more room they have to play different issues off against one another. If you pressure them on the nuclear front, they activate their proxies in Lebanon or Iraq. If you pressure them on the proxies, They threaten the Strait of Hormuz. It is a highly coordinated, multi-front strategy.
Before we dive deeper into the game theory of how these strengths and weaknesses interact on the global stage, let's take a quick moment to talk about our show. This episode is sponsored by The New Sentinel. The New Sentinel is a podcast dedicated to providing in-depth discussions and deep dives into a wide array of topics. From the glitz and glamour of pop culture to the strategic intricacies of military operations, we cover it all. Each episode is thoughtfully crafted to offer listeners a comprehensive understanding of the subject matter, featuring expert interviews, detailed analysis, and engaging storytelling. Whether you're a pop culture enthusiast or someone with a keen interest in global security, The New Sentinel has something for everyone. Tune in, view, share, comment, subscribe, and post an inquiry to stay informed and entertained. Now, let's get back to the board. If we apply game theory to this standoff, how do the strengths of the Western coalition actually mitigate these threats, and are the weaknesses overshadowed by the opportunities?
In game theory, we are looking at a classic dynamic of strategic deterrence. The threat of closing the Strait of Hormuz is Iran's strongest card. It is, in many ways, a more potent weapon than a theoretical nuclear device because its economic impact is immediate and catastrophic. The Western strength, specifically the threat of devastating military retaliation, is designed to make the cost of playing that card prohibitively high for Iran. In a rational actor model, this creates a tense equilibrium. Iran threatens to close the strait to gain leverage, but they stop short of a permanent closure because they know it would trigger a direct military response that could threaten the regime's survival. So, the strength of military deterrence successfully mitigates the threat of total economic blockade, keeping the game in a state of cold conflict rather than hot war.
But what about the weaknesses? We mentioned the depleted strategic petroleum reserve and the lack of domestic appetite for another long-term war in the Middle East. Are those weaknesses overshadowed by the opportunity of this 60-day negotiation window?
Unfortunately, they are not. In fact, the game theory suggests the opposite. The 60-day window is an opportunity, but it is a highly time-sensitive one. Because the Western coalition is operating with depleted strategic reserves and faces severe domestic political pressure to avoid conflict, their bargaining position degrades over time. Iran knows that the United States cannot sustain a high-tension standoff indefinitely without facing severe economic pressure at home, especially with rising energy costs. Therefore, the opportunity of the 60-day window is actually overshadowed by these structural weaknesses. Iran can use the timeline to slow play the negotiations, knowing that as the clock ticks down, the pressure on the Western negotiators to accept a flawed deal only increases. They are playing a game of patience, while the West is playing against a very loud clock.
It's the classic problem of the octopus. You can try to negotiate with the head of the octopus in Tehran, but if the tentacles Hezbollah in Lebanon, the militias in Iraq are still actively striking, the agreement is essentially meaningless. The recent strikes in southern Lebanon, where we saw repeated ceasefire violations and immediate retaliatory strikes by the IDF, prove that the tentacles have a life of their own, or at least are directed to act as if they do.
That state-within-a-state dynamic is crucial. It allows for a level of deniability that makes traditional diplomacy incredibly difficult. It's very similar to how powerful cartels operate in regions with weak central governments. You can negotiate with the official government all day, but if they do not have the power or the will to disarm the armed groups operating within their borders, the signatures on the treaty are just ink on paper. The Lebanese armed forces have shown little capability or willingness to disarm Hezbollah, which means any deal that relies on Lebanese sovereignty to guarantee security is built on sand.
So, where does this leave us? We have a signed memorandum, a 60-day clock that is already ticking, and a situation on the ground that seems to violate the spirit of the agreement every single day. If we look at the horizon, what is the most likely trajectory?
We are likely heading toward a period of prolonged, controlled instability. Neither side wants a total war, but neither side is willing to make the fundamental concessions required for a true peace. The most probable outcome is that we will see a series of temporary extensions, minor agreements, and sudden flare-ups. The danger is that in a system with so many moving parts, where a single rocket strike or a single miscalculation in the Strait of Hormuz can trigger a chain reaction, the margin for error is incredibly thin. We are trying to maintain a delicate balance on a very shaky foundation.
It forces us to ask a larger, almost philosophical question about the nature of modern conflict. Have we entered an era where victory is no longer defined by defeating an opponent, but simply by managing the chaos more effectively than they do? If the goal is no longer to win, but merely to avoid losing while the timer runs out, then we may have to redefine what successful diplomacy actually looks like. As we watch this 60-day window unfold, the real test will not be whether we can draft a perfect document, but whether any document can survive the reality of the forces operating on the ground. The clock is ticking, the reserves are low, and the world is watching to see who blinks first.